Welcome to Salvage, a podcast for conversations with artists about the repurposed materials they use in their art practice. This is Natalia Korover. Thanks for being here. Please enjoy my conversation with Michelle Sirois-Silver. Michelle's works explore themes about ordinary life and the ways she imagines herself within the natural environment. Known for her experimentation, she investigates ways to integrate materials and techniques, adding layers to create framework to support the conceptual narrative of her work. Her art practice encompasses the hand-hooked surface design, and sculpture. I am so glad that you have agreed to join me here. This is the first version of the podcast that I'm recording via Zoom. So everything is new. I hope the sound quality is great, and I hope that I hope everything works out technical wise. I can't speak.
I'm sure it will, Natalia. I'm sure it will. Well, and I'm joining you today actually from the Lekwungen First Nations territory here on the Pacific Northwest on Vancouver Island. So, anyways, I'm really happy to be here today talking with you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for starting off with that. I think, as far as I know, I'm on the land of Lenape-Munsee peoples. I don't know the whole, I'm sure I can find it somewhere, but there's a way to say it all that, the unconceded lands or something like that. So I apologize for my lack of knowledge there. But I think that's fabulous that you started off with that, because, that's something that we need to think about, don't we?
Yes, we do. Yeah.
So the reason I wanted to talk to you today is, well, first of all, I've known you for a long time. So there's a comfort level there. And second is because I find your work really, really fascinating. And even though I sort of now understand how you go about your work, your art making, I have never tried it, so I don't fully have a concept of it. And I know that you do use repurposed materials, which is what this podcast is all about. And that's why I want to talk to you. So why don't we start with let's start with what is the work that you do? If you can give us a small explanation of what your art practice entails, and then we'll delve into what kind of materials you use in your art practice.
Okay. Well, you know what? It's a really good question. I would say that the work that I do is really, it's a very immersive experience. And each element is really important to the work itself. I'm a layerist, so there's many layers to my work. So one of the things that's really important is, in addition to the concept, the materials are very, very important. And the materials that I use actually inform the work. So they're always part of the storytelling. And with regards to the sort of type of work that I make, I work primarily with textiles. So my practice is primarily textile based. And over the years, it started to expand somewhat to include ceramic, also moving from a two-dimensional form to a three-dimensional form. And I use a number of traditional techniques in terms of the making. So I do a lot of hand-hooked work as well. That's really the primary focus of my art practice. But I do hand stitch, and you can see actually a number of pieces behind me in terms of three-dimensional works. There's ceramic, mixed media behind me over my shoulders. So I do a range of work, but primarily textile-based, informed by materials.
And for those of you who are listening and not watching, there will be links to Michelle's website so you can see all the images of her work on her website. Sorry to have interrupted you, but I just want to make sure that people who can't see those beautiful things behind you know where to look for them.
No, that's good. I yeah. So I mean, it's interesting in terms of defining again the art practice, but definitely textile based with a primary focus on the hand hook surface, hand stitch, and sculpture. So,
and what drew you? I think you were doing 3D work before you went into clay making already. Is that correct?
I started to do three-dimensional work, textile-based work, probably just a little bit before. There was an alignment between the two, and each one was connected. I guess I mean really the connection that it was sculptural form.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about sculpture um, from textile and clay base perspectives. Actually, probably they parallel one another in many ways. But
Yeah. I
yeah,
just find it interesting that because, textile, very tactile, and clay, yes, also very tactile, but in a completely different way. And to go from working with soft textile into the hard clay, like what drew you to that? Like what made you want to go in that direction?
the three-dimensional work, the sculptural work, I think part of it was there's a couple of things, and one of it is the way that we physically engage with the work. So, having done two-dimensional work, which always required, for the most part, a pretty static way of working, like, you're just fixed in place. And often, even looking at the work, it's like standing in place, although we might shift a little bit from side to side or try to get a peek of behind the work. But for most of, when I think about it, it was a fairly restricted physical engagement. And so I was finding that over time, in terms of making the work, that um, I needed to bring in something into the art practice that I could engage with differently. And I was always interested in three-dimensional form. And also at the same time, like how do you create a three-dimensional form or a sculpture that's not um, static? So, and what does that look like? And so when I started to approach the three-dimensional work, that's what I was thinking about. And even with the stack pieces, when I started making those, I mean, I could engage with them, in terms of circling 360, moving closer, move back, and have a different kind of physical engagement. But visually, what could I do to animate the work, which is also kind of interesting because when you start using threads to animate the work, I mean, it sort of goes on. But I'm not really sure if I'm answering your question. I mean, and the thing about the materiality is that, I mean, as someone who's making the work, when I'm working with clay, it's in a soft form. It's very malleable, and so it's also has a real strong textile quality to it. And depending upon the work, I mean, have I've been learning how to do throne work on the wheel, but I actually love working with using pinch pots, the pinch pot technique to create the work. And so that for me, it ties in some ways with the textile work. Well, actually, in many ways, because it's so. I mean, the hand of the maker is in it. It's definitely evident, and I have a lot more control in terms of making the work. So it's in many ways, I guess, when I'm making the work, it's sort of an extension of me as I'm doing it. So yeah.
It's interesting to hear that it feels like a textile when you're working with it. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that before. And I guess it makes sense because it's so malleable. And then you fire it, and that's when it becomes hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even, when it's hard, you can create a surface that's very, very tactile.
Mm-hmm.
I recently saw some work by a local ceramic artist, Irene Ives, who is doing three-dimensional pieces that represent it's sea urchins.
Oh,
So she's been doing a whole series around that, and there are concerns with sea urchins in terms of really overtaking the kelp beds and so on.
oh.
So, but she's doing her work. It's very textual. It's very tactile. And in the gallery setting, she encourages people to pick up the work. So it still remains very stimulating, even in its hard form.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Hmm. All right. So let's bring this back to materials. Can you talk us through what kind of materials you work with in your practice? Like, so your let's start with the two-dimensional. So you do rug hooking. I'm assuming your base is a canvas. No, or is it what's the material that's a base for a rug hooking piece that you would do for the wall?
I'm using loose open weave. I mean, ultimately, people can use whatever they want if they can get a rug hook through the surface and pull
Mhm.
up the loops. But um, I I like to work with linen,
Mhm.
um, and for a number of reasons. I mean, there's longevity in the linen, and also because I'm working with a piece for many months and handling it. I want materials that are, I mean, friendly to my hands. So,
Right.
so linen to me is like a gift. When I sit down to make a hand hook piece and I'm working with linen, it's really a gift to myself. As well. So I start with that as the foundation.
And then the materials that you use for each artwork, I assume depending on the artwork that you're hooking, um, the materials are different for each artwork because it depends on the artwork that you're working with. But is it mostly wool? And if so, where do you get the wool?
I work with primarily I work with wool, and part of that is a reflection of how I came into rug hooking, which was through very traditional doors. And
Mhm.
at that time, the community people were working with hand dyed wool fabrics, so that's how I stepped into the community. But at the same time as I was stepping into the community, I was really influenced with working with, at that time, thrift store finds.
Mhm.
And so I, in my early years of rug hooking, I acquired quite a lot of thrift store finds, things people would give me, and I mean, one of the reasons why people were working with wool fabric was because it wears really well. And it has a weave structure that doesn't hold dirt the way that, say, because it's a little bit on the looser side, it doesn't hold dirt the same way that, say, cotton would or other fibers. And so there's that element of it, but also within rug hooking, I mean, there's a real tradition of people working with whatever materials they have on hand.
Oh, interesting. I
So,
didn't know that.
yeah. So essentially, I mean, born out of necessity, born out of thrift, you know, people would save clothing that was beyond repair or anything that was beyond repair. And they would essentially tear it up into strips, roll it up into balls, and then, usually working with, say, a burlap backing. So it could have been a feed bag or a seed bag, and using that as the backing, fashioning their own hook, maybe from a bent nail, and then they would
Oh,
hand hook the fabrics into the backing. So it has a very strong utilitarian history and tradition.
That's fascinating. I had no idea. I mean, I knew that about quilting, but I didn't know that rug hooking had that kind of start as well. That's wonderful.
Yeah, it is interesting.
Yeah.
That's why I think today it's sort of like we've come full circle. And and also it's sort of like how do we acknowledge and integrate those traditions that really, you know, I mean, that go back millennium into our conversations and
Yeah.
practices today.
Oh. So I know that in a series of your pieces, you used hosiery for rug hooking. How did that come about? And how does that to rug hook with?
Well, it's interesting because you just never know. And, the thing about the hosiery, it started over a conversation looking into like a waste paper basket. So essentially looking into a garbage can. And I know it, there's a designer in Vancouver. She's relocated to London, England, but Catherine Soucy from Sans Souci Designs is a fashion designer whose practice is based on circular economy, working with, in her early days, she was working with hosiery seconds. So the conversation started with a studio visit to her studio. I knew about the clothing that she was making, which was really beautiful, and that's what initially drew me to the studio. And while I was in there, I looked into the waste paper basket and saw all of these materials and asked her what she was going to be doing with them. And she hadn't intended to throw them out. She was going to use them for future projects. And so we just started talking about rug hooking, and maybe I could try some of these materials in my work. And there is also, I mean, again, a long history and tradition in terms of working with hosiery. The Grenfell mission in Newfoundland, which goes way back to the turn of the 20th century, they were working with hosiery and eventually working with pantyhose. So there was already that, for me, that existing knowledge and understanding in terms of working with the materials. But, when I saw Catherine's waste materials, I thought, actually, this could be pretty cool. So that was the seed, actually, was a conversation over a garbage can. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, I know.
I've had many conversations over garbage can myself.
It's funny.
Like,
I
wait a
know.
minute. What are you going to do with that? Why is that in there? It has so much potential.
I know it is pretty funny because, again, when you think about it historically, when people were working with things beyond repair, they weren't having a conversation over a garbage can. I think the very fact that we're having conversations over a garbage can is really, I think, reflective of the time and place in which we live today.
I
So,
agree. Yeah.
yeah,
People back then just mended and did their best. Or if they couldn't mend it, it became a rag to do some kind of cleaning with.
exactly. And even hand hooked rugs in people's homes, they would start off like a new rug would be like in a prized location.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say if a family was making one new rug a year, that rug could potentially shift from that primary location to another location in the house, maybe eventually to the front door, the back door, and then it would end up on the wood pile, outside on the porch, which is one of the reasons why we don't have very many hand hooked rugs, because they were just used to the point of just completely falling apart.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's amazing. Well, that's I believe that's how things should be used.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. No. So when you were using the hosiery, did you have to like cut it into wider strips than usually? Because doesn't I mean, my basic knowledge of hosiery that it curves, the strips usually curve. If you cut a strip of hosiery, any knit fabric would curve on the sides if you cut it. So I assume that hosiery being lightweight would curve even more. Did you have to like figure out the logistics of that and make a ton of samples before you figured out the right way of using it?
It's a really good question. And so there's a couple of things. One of the way that Catherine Susie manufactured her clothing, she used sergers to
Mhm.
close the seams on the hosiery, and and working with the serger, you start to create little strips,
Mhm.
and they did come in varying widths, but sometimes they might be an eighth of an inch, but they might be a quarter of an inch or half an inch.
Oh, okay. So everything
And
came to you in strips already.
a lot of it did, not all of it, because sometimes, she would have to cut into her new textile surface that she was creating as well to cut out the patterns. So there would be, sometimes there would be blocks of sewn hosiery strips that would,
Mhm.
or yeah, sewn pieces of hosiery that would also come in. Those I would hand cut. And the narrower pieces, I would just essentially, when I pulled them, then they would tube and create a tunnel. And that's actually how I use the textile, the hosiery. And if you look at those particular pieces, I mean, structurally they're quite different, when you look at them from the wool fabric pieces. So but yes, they have that wonderful tubing effect. There's a lot of elasticity, and working with that material, one of the things I always found with rug hooking is that materials that have some kind of stretch or give are really the best ones, or for me anyways,
Oh, interesting.
the nicest ones to work with. And it has to do with the whole motion of the making and pulling the loop up through the backing. And
Oh,
I should mention, actually, that's one of the things too about the wool fabric. It does have a ease to it when you pull it up through the backing.
interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't think that, a, a basic wool weave, I guess it does have, yeah. I guess it would have more give to it than a cotton, especially a quilting cotton or something like that.
And a quilting cotton, what someone might do is cut it on the bias to
Right.
get that stretch. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, who knew? It's rug hooking, but there's
Right.
so many variations in terms of our materials and how we use them.
Yeah.
So
Wow. So can we talk a little bit about your 3D sculptures? What kind of materials were you using for those?
the three-dimensional pieces, the soft sculpture, started with. I keep looking at one piece that I have up over there. It's informing me. It's telling me what to say as we speak.
Good.
But the three-dimensional works, actually, I guess really what got them going was that I had been thinking again about the three-dimensional work for quite some time, and a friend of mine called me and she said, I have some designer samples. A friend of mine gave them to me, and I was just wondering if you might like to have them. And I'll just, and I said, yeah, sure. That's the hard thing. You never want to say no. So I said, sure. And she arrived at my studio with literally a carload of fabric samples, boxes, like
Wow.
packed to the brim. And this it's a combination of like delight and dismay, because as you know, square footage in a studio is finite,
Yeah.
but I can't say no. So all these boxes came in, and I was working on another piece, something for an exhibition at the same time, and I'm working in my studio, and I'm going, no, Michelle, don't open those boxes. You're going to wait. Don't open those boxes. But needless to say, of course I had to open those boxes, and there were really just a lot of very beautiful designer samples in those boxes, and I did try to give as many of those samples away as I could, but I still had a huge volume. And, you know, as always, an idea comes from, two, three, four, five different sources. And so I started to really kind of pull that together, thinking about, okay, what could I do? I'm thinking three-dimensional work. I also had felted blankets that I couldn't really rug hook with either. And so I just began to experiment with creating the discs. and you know, and just essentially stacking them and just really kind of playing around with them. So um, yeah, so it was sort of uh, I don't know what you call it. It was an alignment of a whole bunch of different ideas, thoughts, and materials kind of
Yeah.
all coming together at the same time.
I think that kind
So,
of I think that that kind of happens in most people's practices. All of a sudden something just strikes you and the right material comes into
yes,
your space.
yeah,
So I have
I
a
know.
technical question about fabric samples. From my experience, they always have some kind of paper backing to them, or at least on part of them. Did you have to soak off the paper backing on all of them?
It's a good question. I mean, there were times there that there were some materials that has stuff stuck on them. So I would try to pull it off. And I mean, really, at the same time, I mean, as I was trying not to be overly precious and reminding myself, I mean, really, in this particular case, I had a lot of materials to work with. So I didn't actually introduce that part into the making process. But I mean, I think it's a really fair consideration in terms of working with reclaimed materials, like in terms of the preparation.
Well, yeah, and I'm thinking if you're stitching them and there's paper backing, some of those paper backings can be pretty thick, so they would be make it difficult to stitch through.
Yeah, a lot of them were, like a synthetic base, something that could really withstand a lot of handling.
Hmm.
So, but I mean, now that you mention it, I mean, it's funny. I really hadn't thought about keeping them within the narrative. Actually, and I think that that would be really interesting, actually, to embed them into the work.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, no,
Interesting.
definitely something to think about. I know someone was talking about the discs, which are often 3, 4, or 5 layers of materials, and and mentioned how with each disc there is like an embedded narrative within each and every single one.
Right.
So yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's interesting. Um, and for the basis of these sculptures, you frequently find some kind of antique things to put them onto as well?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I do. I just love doing that. And it is I have a friend of mine, Val Arntzen, who's an assemblage artist. And anyways, I've always drawn inspiration actually from the way that she works from materials and just the way that they contribute and build narrative
Mhm.
based on the relationship. And over my shoulder is a weigh scale with soft sculptures on it. And that was, I think that might have actually, in terms of found objects, that was the first time I really introduced a found object into the work. With my hand hooked work, I've, I was very heavily introduced by Gloria Krause, who was a textile artist who lived on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. And she always had a book called New Materials, New Techniques. And she always introduced non-traditional materials into her hooked surfaces.
Mhm.
And so I was always working with like grommets and zippers and looking at ways of using them so that they were fully integrated into the work.
Mhm.
And so that was always really important to me. So the three-dimensional work, when I started to introduce found objects, drawing inspiration from Gloria, drawing inspiration from Val, um, it, it, uh, I could see how it would really add in a significant way to the story. So the one that over my shoulder, the weigh scale, that one is called Determine Your Value. And so for me, it's a combination of cheek, being kind of cheeky and pushing back on a question that someone asked me. I had a solo exhibition of hand hooked work and specifically the work with the pantyhose. And that individual kind of threw out an offhand comment about how um, the work or art has no value if it doesn't sell.
Ah,
So,
okay.
yeah. So, you know, of course, for me, it's sort of, I start thinking value, like, how does one determine value? And what does value even mean? And um, so, I mean, for me, value is something that's internal, so my own personal values. So when I think about value, that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah,
So I thought about that question. And so the weigh scale essentially is, you know, when you take art and you put it on a weigh scale, and in this case, it weighs like 2.5 pounds. I mean, it's that whole thing about how does one determine value? And
yeah.
so I like to bring objects into the three-dimensional work that actually contribute to the narrative in some way.
I love that. And
Yeah.
yeah, and it makes people think, and then it also adds an element of whimsy. Like I can't look at those pieces without having a little smile on my face because they're just so delightful.
I know.
I also know that you have used a rock in one of your pieces. Can you tell us about your rock piece, please?
I'm sorry. You know, I laugh because my work brings me so much joy, and which is really wonderful.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, the rock pieces actually that came out of the pandemic, and so over my shoulder you can see there's 5 small sculptures made with rocks actually from my backyard, and part of it was also during the pandemic we moved from one city to another, and I think for a lot of people who were relocating, especially in 2020. In North America, that was it was there was a lot of upheaval and uncertainty around that, and so um, one of my favorite curators, Angela Clark, at the Il Museo Gallery in Vancouver, wanted to have an exhibition that was kind of not, I guess, in some ways, looking at the pandemic or COVID in the rearview mirror, essentially,
Hmm.
because it'd been such a hard time for so many people. She had a theme, it was called Illumination. And so that's the name of the exhibition, this group exhibition that she brought together with a number of artists. And she asked artists to make artwork that would be looking at the light. So the rocks is a long answer, Natalia.
No,
Sorry. No, I'm
I
sorry.
want an explanation of why you use art, a rock in your artwork. Yes. And you're not carving the rock, so
No, I know. And I think, you know, so for me, the rocks is about it's a representation about the experience of being in COVID. I mean, again, we were in stasis essentially. I
Mhm.
mean, we were frozen in time. You know, I think of it as a 4 year period, but those first 2 years, especially, it was like we were frozen in time. And the rock, there's something very permanent about the rock. I mean, it is essentially, you know, it's a static object.
Yeah.
But what do you do with a static object? And again, how do you look for, you know, the light within that static object? And as an artist, you know, how do you technically animate a rock? So, anyways, those rocks they're embedded in clear resin pour with gold leaf, and so essentially they rise up out of the gold leaf, and on top are um, hand crocheted fabric discs using linen and a hardener, and so that's the discs are they look like flowers actually
Yeah.
on top of the rock, and then there are miniature models of people actually gardening on the very top. And so for me, that was the thing. It's sort of like how do you take a really, you know, yeah, really an experience that really, I think for many people changed their lives. And how do you take that and really demonstrate resilience? And what does that look like? So working with those rocks, they were really strong, symbolic. They were strong also coming from the backyard. So I think that was the other underpinning for me that became more relevant was the importance of community and having something close and nurturing that. So again, there's so many layers to
Yeah, yeah. But
to
community is a huge layer. I agree with you. Where would
yeah,
we be without our communities? It's so
seriously.
important to our survival, mental
Exactly.
survival, if nothing else.
Exactly. I think that that's the thing. I mean, definitely. I mean, and with regard to, the community that you're building here, this whole conversation around using plastic trash, you know, again, many, many layers
Yeah,
to
yeah,
that conversation.
definitely. So, what is on your work table now or in the near future to be on your work table? What kind of repurposing materials might there be if we were to look?
Oh, such a good question. Well, there's a couple of things, and it's a combination. It's kind of nice, actually, a combination of the art practice and actually working towards certain exhibitions. So right now I am expanding the sculptural forms, the stacked pieces, and I'm making more of those for an upcoming exhibition actually in August in Victoria at the Victoria Arts Council. It's part of an exhibition called Shelf Life. So the stacked pieces will be going in there, and it's interesting because it has been um, 2 or 3 years since I've been, since I last made those stacks. And now I'm coming back into it and working with those materials again. And there's something really lovely and familiar about it. It's almost like a friend group. It's really quite
Yeah.
interesting. So I'm continuing to work with those. And then the other thing is actually more hand hooked work and looking at hand hooked pieces in a sculptural form. So I have some particular concepts about looking at the relationship between the three-dimensional work and the two-dimensional work
Mhm.
and what that might look like. So that's for an exhibition for next year. So so it's anyway, so we'll see. It's in the vault, if you know what I
Okay.
mean, for the time being.
Yeah.
But it is actually working with I'm working with wool fabric in these particular pieces. So it is a combination of thrift store finds, fabrics that I've hand dyed, but also new fabrics as
Mhm.
well.
I love that found fabrics can seamlessly integrate with new fabrics or hand-dyed fabrics. And I think that that adds so much more to the work when there's a variety of things in there, including a lot of the repurposed material. So,
Well, I have to tell you something a little funny about that is that for me, when I'm working with my wool fabrics, the fabrics that are the most significant for me are the thrift store fabrics. So, I mean, they have more value to me than the new fabrics.
why is that? What about them gives it
I
more value?
know it's really interesting. Yeah, it really struck me actually a few years ago. I was having a fabric sale in my studio because I have a lot of fabrics, and I had like my new hand dyed fabrics out, and then I had my thrift store fabrics, and I was thinking like the thrift store fabrics would be like a hot commodity, but 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 people were more drawn towards the new fabrics, those ones. And so I had to ask myself, so what, like, that was an interesting sort of dichotomy, like, what's going on here? And I think part of it is that those thrift store fabrics, they have a history, and they
Mhm.
had a history before they came into my studio. And also, I have to work harder to find actually those fabrics. And I have to
Right.
work harder to prepare them because, there's also the whole dismantling, taking
Hmm.
each piece apart, washing each and every one. And so when I'm rolling up, 4 or 5 pieces of a thrift store find, I'm rolling up, pant leg. I'm rolling up a sleeve like that someone put their arm into, a collar that wrapped around someone's neck. So those materials are very layered, and they have a lot more value to me when I'm embedding them into
I
my
agree
work.
with that. And I would also think that they're limited as well. There's only a specific amount, and you never know if you're going to find that plaid shirt ever again or whatever it is. So they become more precious that way. I have to understand that with even my, plastic bags. Every now and then this plastic packaging comes in and it's got a really pretty pattern on it. And I'm like, oh, that makes it a little precious. I don't know where it came from. I may never get any more of it. So yes, it's trash, but it becomes something precious when you're using it in an artwork.
I know, and it's something that's been actually handled by
Mhm.
other people
Yeah.
in some way
Well, in
from
your
like,
case, even worn by other people.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation because it is actually really making me think about materiality in a much deeper way. And, as an artist, it's like, how do I bring that narrative
Yeah.
into my work? How do I share that with people in a way that also says that this is actually important?
It
You
is
know,
important. I find, like sometimes I work with kids and I'm always going into somebody else's classroom. And a lot of people I work with, a lot of teachers I work with are very conscientious about the materials. But a lot of times there's other teachers who are not so thoughtful about it. And the kids, you'll give them a piece of plastic in my case, and they'll cut out one little thing, and then the rest of it goes in the trash. And I'm forever going, wait, you can't throw that out.
no.
Or paper or whatever it is. I'm like, no, just because you're using that one little thing, there's all of this. And that is also so very useful. That people are, I know that there's people out there who are very, they'll use something once and they'll throw it out, or they'll use a portion of something and throw out the other part. And that always like stops me in my tracks because I'm like, but there's so much potential there. You can't. So I think that conversations like this hopefully will make other people who may not think that way, because I hope they do, because, there's so many materials out there for our art practice that are never even glanced at.
I know, and I think as artists, I think it's really important for us to really celebrate, you know, like the materials that we use. I mean that they are important and they do contribute to the narrative.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Even if they're, free because they've been found or something. But yeah,
But even, what, Natalia, I mean, even the word free, I mean, when you think about it, I mean, you think about even for yourself, your labor in terms of interacting with those materials. I mean, really collecting those materials, cleaning those materials, storing them, cataloging them.
yeah.
And then, I mean, it's interesting because really at the end of the day, you know, that end of it, there's incredible value to it as
Oh,
well.
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this, Michelle. This has been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate your time. I
Such
can't
a
wait to share
pleasure.
it with everyone.
Okay. Thanks, Natalia. Take
Thank
care.
you. Thanks for being here. That was a great conversation. You can find the links to Michelle's website and all the people that she mentioned in the show notes. This podcast was created, produced, and edited by me, Natalia Korover. Theme music by R.C. Gaida. Find out more about me at artbynatalia.com. Find out about my community at repurposercollective.com. and about my kids' education initiatives at ecoloop.art. Thank you for listening.